Is it? Okay. Good evening, everybody. I think we'll get started. Welcome tonight to the Wiener Holocaust Library. My name is Christine Schmidt, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research here. And we are really delighted to welcome all of you in the room and all of you online to tonight's hybrid book talk event to celebrate the publication of Professor Dan Stone's newest book, The Holocaust in Unfinished History. He will be led in conversation with Professor Matthew Feldman. The Holocaust is much discussed, much memorialized, and much portrayed, but major aspects of its history have been overlooked and misunderstood. Spanning not just the Holocaust itself, but also the decades since, this sweeping history deepens our understanding of what the Holocaust actually was and its ongoing repercussions across the world today. Drawing on decades of research, the Holocaust in Unfinished History upends much of what we think we know about the Holocaust. Professor Stone draws on Nazi documents, but also on diaries, post-war testimonies, and fiction, urging that in our age of increasing nationalism and xenophobia, we must understand the true history of the Holocaust. And I can highly recommend this book. It's a really terrific study. So congratulations, Dan, on your latest. So before I introduce our speakers, I just want to go through the usual housekeeping. We do have an audience online, a very large audience online. So this first set of housekeeping is for people in the room. We aren't expecting a fire drill, so a fire alarm. In the unlikely case that happens, there's only one exit to the building. It's the same entrance that you came in. So please just exit that exit if you hear the alarm. The loos, the toilets are down in the basement, and you can access that through the lift in the back. We do also have an induction loop for those who use a hearing device that you can set your device to channel T. Now, for those of you joining us online, you will be kept on mute during the entire program, but we will have some time for Q&A after the conversation between Professor Feldman and Professor Stone, and we'll try to take as many as possible in the room and online. Unfortunately, for those of you online, you don't get the opportunity to purchase the book and to have it signed, but hopefully another opportunity will arise to do that. But we do have some books for sale here, so after the talk, we will have a chance to have your book signed. So now to our speakers. Dan Stone is Professor of Modern History and Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London. He is a historian of ideas who works primarily on 20th century European history. His research interests include the history and interpretation of the Holocaust, comparative genocide, history of anthropology, history of fascism, the cultural history of the British Right, and theory of history. He is the author or editor of 20 books and over 80 scholarly articles. His latest book, The Holocaust in Unfinished History, is the topic of conversation tonight. He will be led by Emeritus Professor in the Modern History of Ideas, Matthew Feldman, who is a leading expert on the radical right. He's published 12 volumes, chapters, and comment pieces on fascism and the radical right, and he has consulted widely via hundreds of media interviews and more than 24 cases as an expert witness on radical right terrorism, as well as delivering keynote lectures for the G7, Council of Europe, and many other bodies. Professor Feldman's third collection of essays will appear in 2023, and his History of Fascism will be published by Yale University Press in 2024. So without further ado, welcome Matt and Dan.
Thanks, Kristen. Just a few words from me at the outset. It's a real honor to be here at the Wiener Library and with you, Christine, and with you, Dan, talking about just an outstanding book. A painful book to read, of course, but the detail and I dare say the incisive judgment that is shown, the wisdom in the way in which the book is approached. I promise I'll get the compliments out of the way because I really do think it's a very special, meaningful evening for us. I do feel that this is our sort of generation's George Mossa, and I know I've said that to you, but the range of things that you take on in your work and the way in which you approach them, I think is really inspiring to other scholars, and in this case, your first trade book, to many, many more as well. So we'll dive right in. We have about 50 minutes or so before we move on to questions. And I think the first thing is simply just a title. I'm going to cover three areas: approach, and then the contents, and then we're going to look a little bit at education and memory. And it's an unusual title, I think, in the first instance, an unfinished history. And some of that you say very much at the outset that the last displaced person camp in Germany only closed in 1957. But really quite strikingly, at the very end of the main body, before the conclusion, you throw this challenge, I think. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about this final chapter on Holocaust memory. You say the challenge remains: will the Holocaust be understood? So I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, just to start us off.
Sure. Well, thank you. Let me just also say good evening to everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks very much to Christine and to the library for hosting this this event. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to Matthew for agreeing to do this. Well, I mean, the subtitle, An Unfinished History, I think has various meanings. First of all, it suggests and is meant to suggest that there will never be a perfect history of the Holocaust. There will never be one final version and where we close the book and say, thanks, that's done now. And that's, I think, true for every historical event. But I think in the case of the Holocaust, and I say this in the introduction, it's particularly apt that it should be the case, because it's a logical counterweight to thinking in terms of completion and final solutions and so on. And so as long as the Holocaust continues to be a topic that moves us and that we care about, then there never will be a finished history of it. And I think, of course, that, I mean, I'll take the compliment, but every generation wants to write its own history of the things that it cares about. So I'm well aware of the fact that there have been one or two other books on this subject before, but that doesn't prevent historians from wanting to write their own, of course. It also means, as in the sense that you suggested with respect to Vögenwald, which was the last of the DP camps, that the Holocaust didn't simply end in 1945, and that in some sense it hasn't ended today either. And I don't mean to sound kind of cutesy about that. Obviously, when the Nazi regime was defeated in 1945, that was the end directly of the persecution of the Jews. But the after effects of the Holocaust, not just in the DP camps, but in the lives of the survivors, the creation of the State of Israel, the impact on the architecture of international human rights, refugee conventions and so on, are all connected to the history of the Holocaust and a part of it. And so when we come to the question of memory and education, I think that's what the quotation that you just read is getting at. I suppose I'm trying to say that this history is not done. That the fact that it's still much debated in contemporary culture shows that it's not done. And when I say debated, I also mean that, I mean, there are books now about representations of the Holocaust that take issue with the fact that the Holocaust is being misused, abused, beautified, mocked, etc. Holocaust references on beer bottles, or cats that look like Hitler websites, and so on and so forth. We can all think of those kinds of phenomena, and it's one thing to take a normative position and say, oh, I don't like that, it's kitsch or it's offensive or whatever. But I think more interesting is to take a sort of meta position and say, let's think about why these phenomena exist at all. And the answer, I think, whether we like or dislike them, has to be that it tells you that the Holocaust still remains a crucial component of our culture, and that people who mock it by sticking the Führer on a beer bottle know that. They also know that, that it's still a kind of barometer of our culture, and in that sense, I think it's very obvious that we're very far from being done with the Holocaust.
And you certainly bring the story, right up to the present in your final chapter. And I think it's fair to say that's probably unusual in books on the Holocaust. Many of them will take the 1933 to 1945, the period of the Third Reich. But I do want to just probe you a little bit on the methodological approach, because one of the things I also found perhaps a bit unusual and very welcome is what Saul Friedlander had called an integrated history of the Holocaust. Now, I take that to mean not only talking about the perpetrators and the things that the Nazis and their collaborators did, but also talking about victims and survivors, and making sure that that's a really key part of the narrative that you tell. And of course, Saul Friedlander, I believe, won a Pulitzer for his 2-volume work, for many, many years was seen as a defining work on the Holocaust. But you take a slightly different tack, but it's hard for me to not feel that there's some influence there in the approach to the integrated history of victims and perpetrators.
Yes, I mean, there absolutely is. You've already in 5 minutes name-checked my 2 favorite historians, right? So Mosser on the one hand and Friedlander on the other. And of course, Friedlander's work is an inspiration for mine. And his book, I mean, the 2-volume study is much bigger than this. And so his integrated history also includes extensive discussions, for example, of the Catholic Church, which doesn't really feature very much in my book, for good reason, his biography and his understanding of the church. But
sorry, could I interrupt you to say just a little bit more about the biography?
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, he was his parents were Czech Jews who moved to France, and then after the occupation, they hid him in a convent. And from which he kept trying to escape at the age of 9 or 10 to be reunited with his parents. And then his parents then tried to escape from France into Switzerland. He describes this in the 2nd volume of his memoir, Where Memory Leads, and also in a film that's been made about him by the Dutch filmmaker Frank Diamant, which is very moving, actually, a beautiful film, where he describes how at 3 in the morning, the group of which his parents was part, crossed over the border in St. Gangolf into Switzerland, and they were spotted by some guys leaving a bar who then reported them to the police. And the Swiss authorities at that moment in time, they allowed the adults with children to remain in the country, and those who were without children, they sent back to France, including his parents, who were then sent to Drancy and then on to Auschwitz. And of course, he spent his life knowing that had he been with his parents, that they would have been allowed into Switzerland. And I admire Friedlander because his personal story clearly informs his decision to write about what he writes about, but you would never know it from reading his historical works. He's a fantastic example of a dispassionate historian in that respect. When he writes about the idea of an integrated history, that's, I think, extremely influential. But in his 2-volume work, he restricts himself, when he talks about the victims' voices, he restricts himself to contemporaneous sources, i.e. to diaries and other ego documents or letters written by people at the time. Whereas I also draw on post-war accounts, testimonies, legal depositions, and so on, because I think they also contribute in many ways. You have to treat them carefully as sources, but I think they also contribute to our understanding of the events. So I think he was a little more cautious than, I mean, I think it's a perfectly justifiable methodological position, but I think it was overly cautious from my point of view. And I also think what Friedlander's interesting, and one of the reasons I like him as a historian is that he also writes theoretically about how to write history as well as writing history. And in one of his older essays from the mid-90s, he talks about how the historian should interrupt the text so that the reader doesn't sense that the text has written itself. It's not a mirror of nature. It's actually been constructed by the historian. But actually in his book, in the Nazi Germany and the Jews, 2 volumes, he doesn't really do that. He does lots of other innovative things, but he doesn't really do that. And I thought that's something that I would try and do in my book, because I think it is important to bring in a kind of analytical perspective, and so the reader doesn't think this is just one thing after another as it really happened, but this is there are books like that, and very good books like that. But I wanted to produce something that wasn't simply a narrative of events, but also tried to explain to the reader how I'm interpreting those events as I go along.
And I think in doing that, you can't get away from one of the things I found very powerful is the sort of master frames that you use. And I'm thinking of, you talk a bit about fascist ideology. You make very clear what you feel about Judeo-Bolshevism, that it was the anti-Semitism that came first and was applied to Bolshevism rather than the other way around. And you also talk a lot about colonialism. You use Césaire's view that Nazism is a sort of colonialism returned home, brought into Europe. Although at the same time, you seem to find some aspects of what you called the kind of elsewhere, the suffering Olympics, that groups that have been historically marginalized and persecuted can sometimes set that suffering against one another. So I guess my question there is do you find that comparing the Holocaust with other forms of genocide or empire building and colonialism, human enslavement, are those helpful master frames for you in approaching your work?
So it's such a massive question.
I know, right? And I'm sorry, but one can't get away from the very kind of rich uses of theory that you bring to bear.
I should say, and I think it's important to say this, that the book is written for a more general audience, right? It's not written as an academic book, so that methodological underpinning and the architecture of the book is hidden in a sense. There's no extensive discussion of theory or historiography or methodology. It's underpinning the work, but it's not explicitly discussed at length. I mean, the short answer to your question is yes. I think not only is it important, but it's actually impossible not to compare the Holocaust to other events. Even for those who think that the Holocaust is unique, that's only a position one can arrive at, having compared the Holocaust with other things, right? You can't say that if you don't know anything about any other cases of genocide. So the point of comparison, I think, is absolutely crucial, because one of the things I always say to my students is that Nazism didn't fall out of the sky. Didn't come from another planet. And I try to show in the book how Hitler's ideas were actually quite commonplace across Europe and North America and elsewhere in the interwar period. They were just radical versions of those ideas. But the mishmash of stuff that he drew on, race theory, eugenics, social Darwinism, and so on, could be found everywhere at this moment in time, and particularly in colonial settings. And so the idea of white racial superiority as underpinning colonial settlement and imperialism was, I think, simply a given at the time. The idea of applying those ideas in a European setting, slightly less so. I mean, I think that they had always been there in a sense. Let's say in the Western European understanding of the Irish or of Italians, there are kind of racialized depictions of others within Europe, but a kind of radical reshaping of European demography along racial lines is an innovation of Nazism, really. So first of all, those ideas don't come from nowhere. Those ideas that shape Nazism, which begs the question, well, why Germany? That's, I think, a different matter. But comparative genocide, I think, is now part of the landscape. There's no obligation on historians of the Holocaust to talk about other genocides. They don't have to be genocide scholars. But I think that thinking about the Holocaust as a case of genocide and thinking about genocide as a phenomenon in the modern world, i.e. how not just looking at case studies, but thinking about this as something that defines the modern world, is very helpful in thinking about the Holocaust. And I mean that because when we look at the dynamic that creates the Holocaust, it has to do with, again, not just something randomly happening in Germany. It has to do with the crisis of modern Europe as a whole. And it has to do with the age of empire. Particularly, it has to do with the Great War and its after effects, the civil wars that happened after the Great War, the 30-year civil war in Europe after 1918. It's part of this broader history. And I think to isolate it from that history is to miss something really fundamental about what's going on.
And you're very clear that Nazism is the prime mover for the final solution for genocide during the Second World War. But at the same time, you also say that many of these ideas are, I'm going to use the word latent, need to be activated. And I'm minded of what Aristotle Callis calls a sort of license to do these things. That in a sense, Nazism gave a kind of permission in the 1930s, for example, to pass anti-Semitic race laws. Is that something you'd recognize, that in a sense, even though Nazism was the prime mover, it also gave license to places like Hungary or Romania to ramp up their own anti-Semitic persecution?
Yes, for sure. I mean, actually, of course, Hungary is the first country in interwar Europe to introduce anti-Semitic legislation in 1920. And there are plenty of examples of anti-Semitic persecution across Europe before Nazism comes to power. But I think it is the case that the radical approach to the persecution of the Jews that is at the heart of Nazism does indeed give a kind of license to other regimes to follow suit. because I think that the difference between the Third Reich and other fascist or authoritarian regimes in Europe at this moment in time is that the Third Reich is the only regime that takes race thinking and places it at the heart of absolutely everything that it does. If you look at leaders like Pavelic in Croatia or Antonescu in Romania, you see people who are obsessed with the Jews as well, but they're not quite as obsessed as Hitler is. They don't quite turn the Jew into this metaphysical world enemy in quite the same way, I think, as Hitler does. And so I think when Friedlander talks about Nazism being characterized by redemptive anti-Semitism, I think he's right, but it's right insofar as it refers to the leadership stratum of the Third Reich, to Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, Goebbels, Eichmann, the intellectuals of the SD, the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen, and so on. The rest of the population didn't have to subscribe to this philosophy of history. They had to just go along with it for various reasons. And I don't think that elsewhere in Europe you see quite the same devotion to this idea that the defeat of the Jew is going to redeem, the titular nation in whichever country we're talking about. Or
you say even world history at one point. It's truly apocalyptic for the Nazis.
I think it is for the leading Nazis. It is a kind of apocalyptic philosophy of history that pits the good against evil, i.e. Aryan against Jew. And that is the key that's the motor of history, if you like, that the Aryan race has to win. But in terms of Aristotle's argument about license, I think this is really, a very powerful insight on his part, because it's quite obvious, I think, that the Holocaust is a German-led project. But one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to set out the extent of collaboration across Europe. And I think that, this is not going to be a surprise to specialists, but I think in the popular sphere, we still have a tendency to think about Germans and Jews. And German Jews in particular. And first of all, the German Jews made up no more than about 5% of the victims of the Holocaust. The majority of victims were Eastern European shtetl dwelling Jews, 1 million of whose names we still don't even know. So a huge proportion of the victims do not look like the kind of assimilated Western European Jews that come to mind when we think of the Holocaust. And it's true that the majority of perpetrators were Germans, by which I mean also Austrians, of course, because we're talking about the Third Reich. But the extent of collaboration across the whole of Europe is really shocking, I think, and becomes more shocking as time passes and the more that we discover. And that also has to do with contemporary memory debates as well, I think.
And you say, I think at the end, that it also drives some radical right politics in Central Eastern Europe in particular, but not only there. But that collaboration isn't uniform. Mm-hmm. And I get the sense that you see places like Bulgaria and France in a slightly different way than you might see. You spend a lot of time talking about what happened in Romania and Hungary. And I wonder if you might be able to talk about some of the things that might have made collaboration different in different places.
Sure. I mean, it matters very much whether you're talking about a Nazi-occupied country and then on the type of occupation regime that was put in place. So the difference there between France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and then Norway and Denmark might be instructive, or whether you're talking about an independent state allied to Nazi Germany, so Romania or Hungary until 1944, or Bulgaria, or whether you're talking about countries that have been referred to as puppet states, like the independent state of Croatia or Slovakia. And in both of those cases, I actually think the term puppet state gives slightly the wrong impression, because I think
lack of agency.
Yes, in a sense. I think in both cases they had far more room for maneuver than the term puppet state suggests. And in the case of Croatia, in fact, you see at Jasenovac the only non-German created death camp set up in Europe. So that's extremely important in its own right. But the case of the Axis countries, I think, is the most interesting one, because one of the paradoxes of the Holocaust is that for much of the war years and under certain circumstances, the Jews are safer in Axis countries allied to Germany than they are in Nazi-occupied countries. The Jews of Bulgaria, like you mentioned, although the Bulgarians deport the Jews of Macedonia and northern Thrace, the Jews of old Bulgaria are not deported. The Italians choose not to deport the Jews, not because they are, Italiani, brava gente, but because they want to assert their sovereignty vis-a-vis Nazi Germany, and they want to say, okay, you can maybe have the Jews sooner or later, but in our own time, thanks very much. The Finns don't deport the tiny number of Jews in Finland, and in Hungary. Although there is a massacre of 23,000 Jews in 1941 at Kamenets-Podolski, and the Hungarian regime institutes the labor service in place of military service for Jewish men. Nevertheless, Horthy continues to claim, when pressed by Hitler, that he doesn't understand what Hitler wants. There's a famous report from a meeting at Schloss Klesheim between Horthy and Hitler, where the report says, when asked by Hitler to do something about the Jews, Horthy replied, what should he do? He couldn't very well kill them. He understands perfectly well what Hitler's asking him to do, but he's not going to play along. So Hungarian anti-Semitism under Horthy has a kind of a limit to it. And so the Jews of Hungary are only deported after the Germans occupied the country, albeit with massive Hungarian assistance, but under different circumstances from before 1944. And I focus a lot on Romania in the book, first of all, because I think in the English-speaking world, the Romanian case remains very little known. And actually, the names of places where massacres took place in Transnistria, the area between the Dniester and Bug rivers in what's today Ukraine, were some of the largest of the Holocaust. Bogdanovka, Akhmechetka, Domanovka, Vapniaka, and so on. These are names that don't really mean anything to English speakers on the whole, but they were places where massacres of Jews took place, carried out by the Romanians, not by the Germans. And the Romanian regime under Antonescu, until the autumn of 1942, was responsible for killing somewhere between 300 and 350,000 Jews. So Jews from Bukovina and Bessarabia in Romania, who were deported to Transnistria, and the local Jews of Transnistria, including the Jews of Odessa, who were murdered locally as well. So, but what you see is that after 1942, and this again speaks to the significance of the Axis countries, is that Antonescu changes his mind and is able to change his mind. So once he can see which way the wind is blowing. And again, this is a sign of the fact that he's not quite as obsessed with the Jews as Hitler is. He thinks, okay, it's probably not a good look now to be killing all the Jews. And so the Jews of the Banat and the Jews of the Regat, the old kingdom of Romania, are not deported and remain the largest surviving community of Jews at the end of the war.
Thanks for that. We're obviously into the 1940s now. We're into the Holocaust that in some senses, of course, you talk about it rightly as a continental crime, and deal great deal with collaboration. Some of the things that, at least in past, had really engaged scholars of the Holocaust, you've elsewhere dismissed a little bit as a dating game. And I'm thinking of the date for when the Holocaust started and ended. And I tend to think most people would say that it ended with the end of the Second World War, although we've sort of covered that you feel it's an unfinished history. But you do write that it was a series of steps, not a single decision, culminating in spring 1942. And that was when the first extermination camps were opened, Chelmno being slightly different in that it was gas vans that were parked there in December 1941. But in terms of turning from mass murder of the Holocaust by bullets, in a sense, to genocide, you seem to follow what I think is an influential reading by Christopher Browning that suggests that a decision, or maybe the initial step, was taken in July or somewhere around summer 1941 in what he calls the euphoria of victory, the idea that soon the Axis is going to win the war, rather than later in December when the tanks are stopped outside Moscow, when the US enters the war. Now, could you say maybe a little bit more about where you position yourself? Am I right in thinking that you tend towards the Browning argument of summer 1941?
Yes, in short, you are. And I think it makes a difference that when I was an undergraduate, the debate about the decision-making process for the final solution was the absolute centerpiece of Holocaust historiography, right? That was what everybody debated. And at the time, books by Browning, his early studies, but also, let's think what was being published around 1990, Philippe Barin,
I think of the Richard Breitman as the
Yes,
right, as
exactly.
the sort of
Yeah,
the counter argument.
Yeah,
to that.
Gerald Fleming and so on. For the intentionalist argument, there were those. But that was the debate, and that was what we studied. And I think the Holocaust studies, first of all, Holocaust history is now so much more varied methodologically and as a way of writing history that, although it remains an important topic, it's no longer the absolute be-all and end-all of Holocaust history. However, when it comes to that topic, I think it does make a difference whether you go with Browning's argument about euphoria of victory, or whether you go for, let's say, an extreme case, Hans Mommsen's argument that the Holocaust, the Nazi leadership kind of fell into the Holocaust by accident after, as you say, the tanks got halted before they could reach Moscow. Mommsen talks about the Nazis maneuvering themselves into a cul-de-sac and making the decision to murder the Jews because they can't think of anything else to do. And I think that Browning's argument makes the difference between understanding Nazi ideology as central or not. Because if the decision to kill the Jews was taken at this moment of a kind of euphoria of victory, it suggests that this was crucial to what the Nazis wanted to achieve. It shows the inseparability of the war of annihilation from the war of military strategy, that the two things go hand in hand. Whereas if you date it later, autumn 1941 or even December 41 after Pearl Harbor, yeah, as a kind of revenge. I mean, I think those moments are also important. When the US enters the war, I think it galvanizes Hitler's resolve to kill the Jews. On the other hand, I think it's a decision that has already been taken. And I think that that's most clear at Wannsee, because the old intentionalist argument that said Wannsee was where the decision was taken, I mean, doesn't actually make any sense, because if the intentionalist argument was always, well, Hitler had always intended to kill the Jews, in which case, why was there a need to hold the Wannsee conference if that's where the decision was taken?
It was put off by about 6 weeks.
Yes, it was put off, but the point is, in a really traditional intentionalist reading, you could say, well, Hitler decided in 1920, the party program, or in Mein Kampf, that the Jews had to be killed. In which case, again, what was Wannsee for? And so the reading of Wannsee, which shows, from Mark Roseman and others, that explains that this is not about the decision-making process, but about the SS and Heydrich in particular informing other agencies within the RSHA umbrella and beyond the German civil service that they needed to be on board with this, I think is much more
a kind of a coordination of efforts rather than
a kind of forced coordination.
Sure.
A statement that the SS is taking control of this process, and I think this, where Eichmann and Heydrich set out Goering's authorization to Heydrich from the end of July 1941 to take charge of Jewish policy. Heydrich is then able to sit there and say, okay, you guys need to fall into line really with what I'm saying. It's kind of coordination. It's kind of forced.
Sure, top down forced. Yeah. And I've just written down something you've said there in respect to the so-called dating game. You said, although it remains an important topic, it's not the end all be all. Mm-hmm. And I want to actually use that for the next question, which is not to say that you ignore the Action Reinhard camps of Belzec and Sobibor and Treblinka and the horrors that were there. Mm-hmm. And of course, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Mm-hmm. But I feel like you, rather than this image of industrialized genocide, and I think you make the point that really a lot of that is bound up with the Holocaust in Hungary in 1944, which we can return to. But I feel like you emphasize the brutality of the Holocaust by bullets, the death marches in particular. It's not to say that you de-emphasize the more quote unquote industrialized form, but that you think that that is part of a wider also life in the camps, a wider approach to understanding the final solution.
For sure, I think it is. I mean, I think that the concept of industrial genocide, whilst it captures to some extent what's going on at the Reinhard camps and at Auschwitz-Birkenau, it actually is a kind of phrase that we've got so used to using that it allows us not to think anymore about what's actually happening at those sites. And so even if we just think about the Reinhard camps for starters, which could kill a lot of people in a very short space of time, What actually happened in those places is that they weren't really camps in any meaningful sense. Okay, people were sent there and murdered immediately. Nobody really camped there. There was a small team of so-called work Jews, carpenters and so on, who kept the place running. But everybody else was taken there and murdered immediately. And they were murdered by the CO2 produced from an internal combustion engine. It's not exactly the height of modern efficiency. The engine broke down, had to be repaired. People stood in the snow, naked, waiting to be murdered, knowing they were going to be murdered, beaten, and the whole thing. The idea of industrial genocide as this kind of smooth, functioning, efficient process, nobody gets hot under the collar, etc., I think doesn't really do justice to what was going on there. And the same is true in Auschwitz. When you talk about the gas chambers, again, how are people killed? They're killed with rat poison. It's extraordinarily violent, and this idea of factory line genocide, again, okay, lots of people could be killed, but doesn't really tell you anything about modernity, except the fact that the Third Reich used tools that were available to them. So yeah, I don't, as you say, fail to talk about the Reinhard camps or Auschwitz at all. I think they're very important to my narrative. But it's important, I think, to stress that 500,000 Jews were killed in the ghettos of Nazi-occupied Poland through the conditions deliberately created in them, so that the Jews died of starvation and disease. Another 1.5 million were shot face-to-face in the so-called Holocaust by bullets. And think of the work of Wendy Lauer and others that describes this as I don't know how to put it, the Holocaust by bullets is a kind of colonial massacre writ large. People taken to the edge of their hometowns and shot in pits. There's nothing modern about it whatsoever. And I wanted to write about the death marches in particular, because I think that's a phenomenon that doesn't really feature as much as it should in most synthetic histories of the Holocaust. But I thought long and hard about how to write about these things, and because remember when Daniel Goldhagen published Hitler's Willing Executioners, right?
And I think he does talk a bit about the death marches. He does.
Yes, his book is one of the few up until before Daniel Blattman's book was published that has a large section on the death marches, and that section is actually very good. I mean, I didn't think it was a good book, but not because of what he wrote about the death marches, but what I was going to say was what I thought about was that at the time, Goldhagen got criticized a lot for his kind of tarrying with the violence, and there were those who accused him of writing a kind of pornography of violence and sort of self-indulgent descriptions of violence. And I've thought about this because, as historians, we're trained to write in this kind of mildly self-ironic, distancing sort of way about everything. And really the only people who have defended Goldhagen actually are a couple of feminist historians, Karen Ball and Carolyn Dean, who made the point that maybe was it so wrong to be angry about the Holocaust? Why shouldn't he be a little bit angry about it? And so I've tried to kind of tread a path of setting out the brutality of what happens, and to say we shouldn't hide from ourselves what actually happened during the Holocaust, but without, I hope, kind of indulging in it unnecessarily.
No, and I think part of it is that you're enjoining the reader to move away from this thinking about industrialized murder and a sort of factory line genocide. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that picture comes from the deportation and murder of Hungarian Jews, some 430,000 individuals murdered in, I believe, 56 days or something like that.
Well, that number deported, about 2/3 of them murdered on arrival. The other third registered into the camp and then sent off to subcamps and so on as slave laborers. But yes, I think that's where this image comes from, primarily because it's in the spring of 1944 that the spur of the railway track is built into Birkenau itself. And so we're all familiar with that image, but we think that's what the Holocaust was about, but it was only created in the spring of 1944 for the very last phase of the Holocaust. So in a sense, the image that we have of the Holocaust in our heads is aberrant in the history of the Holocaust. It doesn't capture what was going on for most of the history of the Holocaust. And the I think the other reason why we're able to think about that period is because of the so-called Auschwitz album, the Lily Jakob album, which was discovered after the war, and which is a complete record of the process of the arrival and sorting and selection of a transport of Jews from, I can't remember where now, somewhere in Subcarpathian Ruthenia, maybe someone knows. Remember? Anyway, somewhere in Hungary, and it was taken by members of the SS. You can see this quite clearly. I mean, photography was forbidden in the camps, but you can see that people standing on top of wagons to take these photos, and it was created as a gift to one of the commandants in the camp, and it shows this whole history, and the images from it have been reproduced everywhere. And so I think when we think of the Holocaust, that's what we think of.
And you, in a sense, kind of like to return our attention to the brutality. And I'll just, you say that that's sort of the penultimate, as it were, killing process. And then the death marches, of course, happen after that. But it's really the start of the Holocaust by bullets that kind of opens this genocidal chapter. And you really make the point that the Einsatzgruppen, some people, and I think it bears noting that many of those people were typists or truck drivers. So you're really talking about 1,500 to 2,000 shooters who are doing this day in and day out, murder 1.5 million people between about mid-1941 and mid-1942. And that, in a sense, commences what we would recognize as the Holocaust.
Yes, I mean, it's not only the Einsatzgruppen. So there are these up somewhere in the region of 2,500 to 3,000 men from the RSHA apparatus, but they're also joined by the order police, that's to say the regular police force in the Third Reich, about whom Browning famously wrote in Ordinary Men, so Police Battalion 101. And actually, I think the order police are responsible for killing more Jews in the Holocaust by bullets than the Einsatzgruppen are in absolute numbers. And they're the people that also include the typists and the clerks and the people who are involved in the machinery of
and these are
occupation.
Reserve policemen, right? I mean, they're sort of not frontline soldiers.
Yeah. That's the regular police. So the Einsatzgruppen are established with the purpose of murdering Jews behind the front lines, but they're joined by all these other groups, and not just the order police, but there are groups of firefighters and so on who also take part in these shooting operations. And so, yes, this is the first stage in this development of genocidal policy, I think. Yeah.
And I think you make the point that, some of that is through the collaboration, if we can call it that, is through greed or shared ideology or shared anti-communism, that in a sense, the motivation for collaboration can vary quite widely, even within Germany, let alone, other countries in Europe.
For sure. I mean, again, I think it's not, if we're talking about the population of the Third Reich, it wasn't necessary for ordinary Germans to subscribe to this kind of metaphysical version of history that pitted the good against evil and the Aryan against the Jew. Nevertheless, I think that the way that the Third Reich functioned through the welfare system, the Hitler Youth, the policy with respect to the churches and so on, everything was shaped in such a way as to make people into Nazis, whether they wanted to become one or not. And so they were, I think, even for people who didn't set out to be active collaborators, they often found themselves in the position of propping up the regime just by going about their ordinary business, because you had to have the right kind of identification to access welfare services, and you had to prove that you weren't Jewish, etc., etc. So all of these things added up to a kind of way of propping up the regime. I mean, there are debates among historians, obviously, between those like Peter Fritscher or Robert Gelately, who think that the regime was actively supported by the majority of the population, and those like Richard Evans and Ian Kershaw and Jeff Ely, who would say, well, we shouldn't forget that the regime was propped up by terror and the threat of concentration camps. And it's a matter of taste, I think, which one you side with. But either way, the extent of collaboration from the German population, I think, was driven partly by buying into Nazi ideology, and partly for other reasons, so venality and opportunity and so on. And once you step outside of Germany, I think that becomes even clearer. So not at the level necessarily of states like Vichy France or Romania, but at the level of institutions like, say, Ukrainian auxiliary police battalions or Baltic camp guards and so on. This was often a way for nationalist movements like the OUN in Ukraine, who aligned themselves for a while with Nazi Germany to advance their own cause, i.e. to win an independent Ukrainian state. They also happened to agree with the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazis and took part in killings of Jews. But at the level of individuals as well, you see, I think, people didn't really even have to be particularly anti-Semitic to take part. At the level of peasants in Eastern Europe, you see their neighbors, their Jewish neighbors were shot, they would step into their houses and take a few pots and pans.
Or even pillage their bodies.
Right.
I mean,
yes.
again, you force us to look at those things.
Yes.
Again, I'm on the theme of brutality, and it's very clear that you're saying some of this is carrot and some of it is stick. But in many cases, it's brutal pillaging of the bodies. I believe you even called the Third Reich a kleptocracy.
Yes, I mean that's not.
No,
that's
but
that's a term that I also steal. But
you make a great store out of the fact that there was plunder throughout the Holocaust.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I don't think many historians would argue that the Holocaust was driven by greed and the desire for theft, but it was certainly a nice side effect of the Holocaust. And the documentation from the Reinhard camps shows that the Nazis were also driven by venality, and that they totted up the value of all the stuff that they'd stolen, including stuff taken from people's bodies, gold teeth and so on, in the Reinhard camps. So, I mean, the Third Reich, I think, generally was a kleptocracy. Its treatment, for example, beyond the Holocaust, the fleecing of the Dutch economy, for example, is phenomenal, and was completely designed, of course, to maintain standard of living on the home front so that it wouldn't collapse like it did in the First World War. And so this brutal treatment of the whole of Europe, disguised under the notion of a kind of German-led European Union, was clearly designed to sustain German hegemony in Europe. But with respect to the Jews, the plunder was absolutely crucial to.
And here we get, again, the sort of the new order looks a lot like the old order in colonial context outside of Europe, which again I think is a point that you make, and it's that plus the brutality that it is, again, I think different, not wrong, but different than many books on the Holocaust. The other thing that I don't believe that you've written on is extensively, and we have about 10 minutes or so just to cover memory and education a little bit. And I think the view that you have that struck me the most is your statement that the Holocaust teaches nothing except the deep passions that owe nothing to rational politics can move human beings to do terrible things. And we could talk about what, the caveat and the teaches nothing, but the sense I get is that you're a bit skeptical about whether the right lessons can be drawn from the Holocaust, or that those lessons exist for us to pick and become better citizens. Is that fair, the skepticism?
Yes, it is fair. Yes, that's a kind of rhetorical flourish there. The Holocaust teaches us nothing. I think that when I write that, what I'm thinking about is the way in which Holocaust education is designed, particularly I'm talking about for school kids now, not at university level, is designed with the well-meaning hope that by learning about the Holocaust, it will turn children into nicer people who won't then go on to persecute others when they grow up. I think that's kind of fantasy land, personally, and my point is not that there are no lessons from the Holocaust. My point is that where the Holocaust is turned into lessons for school, anti-bullying and so on, it's not really very appropriate. Of course, one should learn not to bully people, but you don't need the Holocaust to do that. And my point, I think, is that it's not that there are lessons from the Holocaust, but there are interpretations of the Holocaust, and we can argue about what the Holocaust means, what we think it means for us now, and what interpretation we place on it. But to reduce that to a kind of lesson or to a lesson plan, I think is kind of degrading, really. I don't mean to say that Holocaust education is pointless or shouldn't happen, but I think we need to be very careful in thinking about how much weight we place on Holocaust education and what we expect of it. there are studies which show how children who've received Holocaust education self-report that they won't be horrible to other people and so on when they're older. And I'm sure they mean it. But I think the reality is that it's perfectly possible for people to be moved by Holocaust education and by Holocaust commemorative ceremonies and so on, but nevertheless not really object to government's policies on the dehumanization of migrants and so on. I don't think, or to be moved by Holocaust education and still to look at the crap that's in the news every day and think, yeah, well, so what?
And actually, I do want to press you on that a little bit, because I think another skepticism you have, or something that you find unsatisfactory is what you've called beautifying the Holocaust in the Western world, the lauding of survivors and the rescuers and their moving stories and a desire to, which you put in inverted quotes, learn from the Holocaust. Would thinking more about other issues, let's say state power, the resurgence of fascism, or the seductive power of fascism, perhaps, you mentioned dehumanization of migrants or ethnic and religious, if those were part of a Holocaust curriculum, even for children, would you be less skeptical about it? I guess what I'm getting at is, are you skeptical about Holocaust education full stop, or the way in which we're doing Holocaust education right now?
It's a good question. A bit of both, I think. I'm skeptical about it full stop, because I think that Holocaust education can't change the world. That if we want the lessons of the Holocaust to be learned, i.e. that people should be nicer to one another, then we should change the world first and create a world that isn't shaped around massive inequalities and destruction of environments and so on. And then those lessons would probably be hearable in a way that they're not now. On the other hand, I also think that when the Holocaust is taught well, and it often is at certain schools, the emphasis is not simply on sort of feel-good stories about survivors rebuilding their lives and such, but is precisely to ask very uncomfortable questions about, as you say, the modern state, about, I mean, look, think an actual example might be to say, look, how did the Nazis come to power? They were not voted into power. They never won a majority. They were maneuvered into power by an established political elite. And when we look around modern Europe and beyond today, we see countries where the post-war consensus always maintained, well, we would never work with the far-right/fascist parties, starting to be chipped away at.
The sort of conservative midwifery, right, to...
Exactly.
Because these guys are less bad than the guys on the left, essentially.
Yes, exactly. So the overblown fear about the threat of communism in Germany after 1930, and today, I mean, I don't know who could possibly think there's a communist coup likely anywhere in Europe, but the argument from the right, I mean, this is about, I think, elites simply not wanting to lose power, irrespective of who to. And so there comes a point where they think, okay, maybe we'll get into bed with these unpleasant types for a while, and it won't be an issue. We'll get rid of them again soon. But you know, once you open the door,
I mean, I think that conservative seduction feels to me like a really powerful lesson, and it feels like you do too. That, in a sense, there has to be that cordon sanitaire between radical right parties.
Yes, and again, I don't think it's not a lesson in the same sense that I mean lessons that are taught at school. It's an interpretation, and I think one that can be contested as well. It's not a given, but I do think that there are bigger questions. When you quoted at the start my question, will the Holocaust be understood? And I think that I feel that very keenly with respect to commemorative ceremonies and so on, where you see the pillars of the establishment being moved by the thing that...
But they're sort of helicoptered in, and then they shake hands and they're off.
Yes, and actually, historically speaking, it's the pillars of the establishment who've been the problem, and it doesn't always leave the best taste in the mouth, that's all.
So, and I could, of course, do this all day, but I'm aware that my time is up. We're going to throw it open to the audience. But I do want to have just a last question about Holocaust memory, because I feel like what you're saying now is very much about our present and the way in which we construct the past and we remember it. And so you conclude by saying that in times of perceived crisis, fascism offers a style, a vocabulary, and a simple set of answers to which some people seem instinctively to turn. And I suppose what you say then, what does this mean for understanding Holocaust memory? That is to say, the ways in which the Holocaust has been commemorated, remembered, legislated, and contested in the public sphere in the decades since the end of the Second World War. And I think you lay that out very well, but it's one of the few places where you're slightly non-committal yourself about what you think it means for Holocaust memory. You talk about we're in a post-truth age now. What kinds of challenges do you think going forward in terms of remembering, commemorating the Holocaust, will we continue to face?
God, that's a really tough question to finish with. Look, I mean, Hannah Arendt said that with Auschwitz, something had happened in history that should not have been allowed to happen. It changed something about the human condition. And I think that quotation you read about the contemporary far right and the kind of reservoir of ideas and the style and aesthetics of fascism is a kind of consequence of that now something exists in the world that didn't previously and that shouldn't really exist. And that when the contemporary far right reacts to what's going on in the world, of course it uses contemporary issues as its initial hook. So political Islam, migration, etc., etc. But as soon as it starts talking about those things, it immediately uses a kind of stock of ideas that sound familiar to us. And they sound familiar because they immediately come from this period.
For example, dehumanization, just to take one of many examples.
Yes.
Or a sort of instrumentation of the Holocaust. It's not necessarily Holocaust denial, but you make really strong points about places in Central Eastern Europe that, in a sense, is trying to turn perpetrators into victims.
Yes, or to focus only on rescuers and not, to only give half of the story. I think is something that's very common at the moment. So the first, I think, lesson about commemoration is that we have to try not to remember selectively. I think that we have to try and remember the really brutal, what the Holocaust really meant in terms of destruction and trauma and brutality, not just about rescue and the more palatable side of things. But secondly, I mean, it's a really hard question to answer, I think, because the passage of time naturally means that the Holocaust is passing out of living memory. 3 generations and then you're done. And so what happens after that is, if we want to retain the significance of the Holocaust, we have to do so in a way that is moving for and significant for our contemporary culture. And I think that is where we have to start moving away from kind of platitudinous commemorative ceremonies and asking more complex questions. And that, I think, to ask those questions rather than to simply perform a kind of standard template of commemoration is a much more powerful way of keeping memory alive.
And I'm going to pass over now to Christine, but you've really invited me, as I'm sure you'll invite readers themselves, to really think about those issues. They're not a sentence or two, it's a full chapter. And I think that is unusual in a history of the Holocaust. And it was, not always comfortable reflection, but very thought-provoking. And thank you for the conversation tonight and indeed for writing such an important book.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you both for that conversation. That was, I think, a really excellent way to introduce the book to those of you who haven't had a chance to read it. And now we have questions. I'm also going to ask my colleague Martina to keep tabs on questions from the audience online. I forgot to mention this. If you have a question online, please just type it into the chat and then we will, I think they got it already. So I have 1, 2, 3 questions here, and then I'll come to online. So wait for the microphone, sorry.
Thank you, Anna Haikova. Dan, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I cannot wait to read the book. And I thank you also for the very strong political ending. I think it's very meaningful to all of us. My question is, you wrote one of your first books that is an overview of the Holocaust. It is also your first trade book, but I'm less interested in the trade aspect and more what was it for you to write an overview history of the Holocaust? As you said, others have written it, both you and your colleague, the late David Cesarani. His book was published posthumously. So if you could offer your reflections on how did you go about it? What is difficult about it? Did you enjoy it? Anything you want to share?
Well,
You got it easy with me. The audience isn't going to let you off so easily.
I don't know. I don't want to talk about myself. Yeah, I did enjoy writing it. If you look at the book, you'll see that there's a long introduction, and the introduction was for me the hardest part to write, because when I started to write this, I thought, okay, this is a book that is, I hope, going to get read by more than like the 5 people who might read a research monograph. So I need to actually sit down and think properly about what I want to say. So it took me quite a while to work through the various issues that I wanted to stress in the book. And I'm aware of the fact that the book doesn't talk about certain things that it could, and that's just a choice that you make. But once I'd written that and kind of clarified my position and what I wanted to do, then the rest was, I won't say plain sailing, but it was easier, and it came fairly smoothly. So yes, I mean, I enjoyed writing it insofar as I think that there comes a point where one's able to write this sort of book, because I've been teaching and writing about this stuff for 25 years, and so you think, okay, now I know where to look for the relevant material, and I feel comfortable in defending my choices. So if somebody says, well, there's not very much about Jewish resistance in the book, I can explain why. So yeah, I did enjoy writing it, because it was a chance to really set out the things that I think. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You say, why was Germany singled out? Well, I'm just looking on 2 aspects. Historically, you have Luther, who always hated the Jews, and you have Nietzsche, who hated democracy. And then looking from the angle, I'm a Christian believer, Germany, they were the only country that refused to have any Holy Spirit revival. I think it came here, UK. They hated Christianity. They thought it was a faith of pity and love. Love paralyzes. It upholds life's disinherited, condemned. And they hated that. They just wanted power. So, that's the difficulty. They had no foundation. And if you look at today, we could say about UK, it's all become like almost secular humanism. I think that foundation of Christianity may have had an effect on Germany.
I'm sure it did, but it's a complicated history, isn't it? I mean, my immediate response would be sure, but unfortunately, it's also the case that during World War II, or at least at the start of World War II, something like 95% of the German population were paid up members of a church. And so the idea that religion was not important in Germany, I think can't really be sustained. The leading Nazis, of course, tried, Himmler and the SS saw themselves as the avant-garde of a kind of Teutonic religion that would eventually replace Christianity, but that was not the case during the war. And the majority of perpetrators ordinary Germans who took part in the Holocaust, most of them were church members. And when we look at the broader European context, it's even worse. If we think about, particularly in Slovakia and in Croatia, countries that are now defined by historians as clerical fascist, were led by people whose ethno-nationalist vision for their countries was underpinned by their Catholicism. And in the case of Romania, the inseparability of the Romanian Orthodox Church from the Holocaust in Romania is astounding, actually, and its continued denial of its involvement after the war up until the present day is equally astounding. So yes, I know very well that there's an argument that says that Christianity is about love of one's neighbor, and that it's the attack on Christianity that is the problem. That was a very common, particularly in this country, it was a very common Church of England response to the rise of Nazism in the 1930s. But unfortunately, the majority of people involved in the Holocaust had some connection to Christianity.
Not true Christianity.
Well, sure.
Wasn't the head of Jasenovac a serving priest?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
The head of the Slovakian regime was a serving
Yeah,
priest.
was a priest. Yeah.
These aren't
and so
Christians.
no, I mean exactly. And so of course they probably also understood the Ten Commandments, but you know, to borrow David Baddiel's phrase, Jews didn't count.
Yeah, you sort of answered partially my question a moment ago. I was going to ask you, you've chosen to write the book chronologically, and so it'll be interesting to see how various themes pan out across the period. One theme that I was going to ask about was resistance, and I was going to ask to what extent do you deal with that in the book, and also you'll probably get this out of the art. You'll probably answer this, but what I'm interested in really is, can you write a history of the Holocaust without resistance as integral to it, or is it quite easy to overstate resistance?
It's a very difficult question. I think I'm inclined more to the latter, because I think no, I'm not going to say that. There's a lot written about resistance, and I think it's a very well-known phenomenon. And I mentioned in passing the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, for example, the Sonderkommando Uprising in Birkenau, uprisings in Sobibor and Treblinka. But I don't go into detail about it because I think that the history of resistance is, whilst important, obviously, is not central to the history of the Holocaust in the way that the things I wanted to stress are. And I'm aware of the fact that that is a statement that can be picked apart, but you have to make these choices, I think, when stressing certain things rather than others.
Okay, I think we can turn to a couple questions from the online audience. Jenny is asking, would Professor Stone tell us a bit about the drawing on the front cover
Yes.
Of the book?
For sure, thank you. That's a very nice question. This comes from a book published in Paris in 1946 called Témoignages d'Auschwitz, Testimonies from Auschwitz, published by the Amicale d'Auschwitz, so the Association of Former Auschwitz Deportees. And it's a book, it was published in 1946. It's a collection of material from former deportees, including surviving Sonderkommando members and others. And the line drawings in the book are really extraordinary, I think. And this one in particular I wanted to use because it captures an aspect of the Holocaust that I write a lot about in the book, but which is often not discussed in the synthetic histories, which is to say the slave labor subcamps. And so here you see, you know, it's not a kind of typical Holocaust image of barbed wire and concentration camps, but rather you see a group of women performing slave labor. And that, I think, captures a particular aspect of the Holocaust that is often neglected. And I think they're really simple and very powerful images in this book. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Okay, and then another question from Paul. Could Professor Stone say something about whether his thinking about the Holocaust changed while he was writing this book?
I'm not sure it did really, no. I think the writing of this book forced me to think through where I stand on things and to try and articulate that clearly. But I don't think I think I'd thought about what I wanted to say and then wrote the book. And I don't think the process of writing itself didn't change my views on anything, actually, I don't think.
Thank you. So we can take a couple other questions here. Let me just see, there's a couple, just going to check in the back first. Here.
Hi, Dan, thank you for a brilliant introduction to everything. I wanted to ask about film, because you don't mention the influence that film can have as an educational tool. And I wonder if, I mean, I was profoundly affected by, in 1985, by seeing Shoah, although that's 9.5 hours long, and I wouldn't suggest that's useful in schools. But if you think of Schindler's List, which I think is used regularly in schools, and even the film Denial, which I think is an excellent analysis of things which children could benefit from. Do you think the role of film has some function for children?
Did you work for the British Board of Film
Yes,
Censors by any
did.
chance? Yeah, yes, I do think so. But I think I mean, I didn't write about film. Again, it's a matter of choices, and so I don't think writing about film is my forte, and so I deliberately didn't. But yes, of course, I do think that. Actually, I don't know about Denial or Schindler's List. I think also Schindler's List is too long, really, for most school children. What is 3.5 hours, isn't it? Whereas at least Shoah can be shown in extracts. Though I think it's tough for school children to watch. I wouldn't really recommend it, I don't think. But I think, I mean, to my mind, one of the best films, Holocaust-related films that I can think of is Conspiracy, about the Wannsee Conference, because it's unusual in that it's you know, it's a mock-up of stuff that has happened before, but it's not the usual cliches of smoke-filled rooms and terrible German accents. It's filmed in the Wannsee Villa. I find it impossible now to think of Heydrich without picturing Kenneth Branagh, who I think is absolutely chilling in the role. And I think what's brilliant about it is that it's filmed kind of in real time, so that it's just an hour long, the length of the meeting. They arrive, they have their discussion. Heydrich takes, who is it? Is it Kritzinger? Can't remember. Takes Kritzinger for a little walk and threatens him with meat hooks if he doesn't collaborate. And then they return and you know, get slightly merry, and then it's over. It's I think a really chilling film, short, to the point, brilliant. There are more recent films I think are good for Holocaust education. Films like Jojo Rabbit, for example, which I actually, despite all the criticisms, I thought was a very good film. And but I wonder whether it can be used without quite a lot of preparation, so that children understand what it is, why they're laughing at certain things and not at others. I mean, its mocking of Nazi ideology was brilliant, I think, but unless you already know something about that, I don't think it's very easy to understand. So, and I think that's often the case in film, that it kind of assumes stuff.
Life is Beautiful?
Not to school children, I wouldn't. I think it's too kind of mythified for a kind of the sort of literal understanding. Open to misinterpretation, let's say, yeah.
That was Life is Beautiful for people online who probably didn't hear. I'm going to turn here to this question.
Hi, I was wondering, in your view, to what extent did the perpetrators conceive of what they were doing as a morally good thing to do, and how did that vary at different levels of German society, and what was the role of remorse in kind of the post-war aftermath of all of that?
Those are hard questions too. I think that, I mean, from the point of view of the Nazi leadership, they totally understood what they were doing as a moral thing to do, that this was about saving the German people, or the Aryan race from the threat of the Jew. And in that sense, it was a morally virtuous act to kill the Jews. The question about, or how that varied, again, I would come back to what I was saying earlier, which is, I think for the true believers, which is I think a pretty small stratum of the Nazi leadership, this was absolutely central to their worldview. To much of the rest of the population, there's some kind of negotiation of a path between ordinary life and subscribing to the kind of crazier aspects of Nazi ideology. And I think there's a lot of mockery of Nazi ideology that goes on in the Third Reich, at the same time as people are nevertheless end up, as I said before, bolstering the regime through their daily lives. So I think that's very complex. Remorse after the war, I think that's a totally separate topic. I mean, you can find some, but institutionally, there's, I think, a lot of statements by, for example, the churches, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, and so on, very early after the war. And then they kind of very quickly chip away at that and take back quite a lot of what they've said in statements in the later 40s and into the Cold War. And it takes another generation, a generational shift in West Germany in particular, to start talking seriously about remorse. But even then, you know, we know from the student movement of '68 and so on, that's bound up with kind of versions of fascism and attacks on the parents' generation that mean that these things are not properly worked through until much later, indeed, if they have been at all. So you can find, of course, examples of remorse, but it's in the West German discussion and in the Berlin Republic discussion, it's often also bound up with notions of resentment and humiliation and shame and pride and so on that make this sort of conversation extremely complicated.
Okay, before I come to the question here in the front, there's just one question that's maybe slightly related to that from Rachel online. She says, you're looking at the extent of participation in the Holocaust by other nations. Do you worry that German readers may be drawn to read your book as a chance to shrug off responsibility? I can imagine members of my own family doing this. What might you say to readers who take this line?
That they shouldn't. I mean, I think the point here is, there is a serious point here, I think, and the historian Jan Grabowski, who's obviously, you know, of Polish origin but teaches in Ottawa, he published an article in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, called "Germany is Fueling Holocaust Distortion," something like that, where he attacked the dominant position in the German memory landscape, which says only Germans were perpetrators of the Holocaust. We can't say that anyone else was a perpetrator because this somehow diminishes our guilt. The problem is that in Grabowski's reading, that then allows others who were perpetrators off the hook. So I think that you have to turn that comment on its head and say it's historically correct to say that there were perpetrators other than Germans. Nevertheless, we should remember that the majority of perpetrators were Germans, and therefore the idea that this saying so lets the Germans off the hook is nonsense. And it's no, I mean, from my point of view, it's not about, I mean, we're 80 years after the Holocaust. It's not about putting people on the hook or not. It's about historically accurate reporting about what happened during the war.
Thank you for that. Okay.
Thank you for a fascinating and challenging discussion. I was wondering if we could just return to something you said, Dan, early on about the Olympics of suffering and the importance of acknowledging the fact that the Holocaust is not the only genocide that has taken place. And I'm just wondering whether you feel it receives, whether it's now time for a rebalancing and whether the Holocaust receives a disproportionate amount of attention.
No, I don't think so, because genocide studies, insofar as it's a discipline, is now a very multifaceted, multidisciplinary phenomenon in its own right. There's a lot written about genocide by lawyers, sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists, economists, demographers, etc., etc. And there's no obligation on anyone to write about the Holocaust if they don't want to. And so if people choose to write about, if they want to be experts on Rwanda or Cambodia or the Armenian genocide, then they can. So go on.
Sorry, I was thinking also just because you were talking about education, more broadly than just the academics.
In that case, I think that, sorry, the question, if people online, the question is about the broader educational landscape. I think in that sense, that's already happening. So Holocaust Memorial Day, for example, although it's called Holocaust Memorial Day, if you look at the annual ceremony that takes place in Westminster, it's clearly about commemorating genocides that have occurred since 1945. That's also not unproblematic for obvious reasons, but that's the remit of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. And if you look at what goes on at grassroots level across the UK at Holocaust Memorial Day, actually it's much more interesting that people do all sorts of things that don't necessarily adhere to HMDT's remit, and they talk about all sorts of other things as well. And in that sense, I think that for me, a kind of unexpectedly good result of the introduction of Holocaust Memorial Day was precisely to get people talking about genocide. What does genocide mean? Where does genocide stop and something else, crime against humanity or whatever, take place? And so I think those discussions are happening, and I would go further and say it's not that the Holocaust has impeded a discussion of other genocides. Rather, I'd say that this discussion of the Holocaust has helped him promote them.
Okay, thank you. So I think at this point, probably we need to close so that we have time for more conversations with Dan one-on-one, as we have some time to, his book is for sale and he'll be signing his books in the back. So if you can let him move to the back, that would be great. But it just remains for me to thank everybody here tonight for coming, our online audience, and of course, Professor Feldman and Dan Stone for this fantastic conversation. And congratulations again, Dan, on your book. Thank you.